Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. My name is Brad Aeon. I'm an assistant professor at University of Quebec in Montreal, Canada. I'm also a time management expert. I've been doing research on this topic for past 12 years now. It's a topic that I hold very dear. It's a topic that's very, very important to me, simply because I think it's the key to having a higher sense of purpose, more well-being, better life satisfaction, but also because it's really a topic that speaks to all of us. We all need better time management in our lives. And that's why I've spent the past 8 years or so spending a lot of time in the media trying to make all this research, all this science about time management more accessible to the general public. The problem is that very often these studies are extraordinarily helpful. It's just that they're not particularly easy to read. So that's why my goal is to make this research as accessible as possible to help as many people as possible. I've also had the opportunity to work with organizations around the world, whether they're for profit, nonprofit, educational, and so on. It's been so gratifying to see all this research that may sometimes sound very abstract and conceptual and theoretical finally make a difference in the real world. And I think this is important because very often we assume that research can be a bit too theoretical and it has no real implications for the real world. But I think that at least in the case of time management, we can drastically improve the way we manage time if we look at what the research says. Now, without further ado, let's move on to the actual research. I have a little question for you. Why do people say that they've just come out of a short meeting, or that some events happened a long time ago, or even that school lasts through the day, or that they can't reach customer service outside of business hours? Why, in other words, do we use spatial adjectives to talk about time? Because there's no other way for us to talk about time, really. Linguistics research shows that around the world, human beings think of time in spatial terms at a very basic cognitive level. So whenever we think about time, we think of it in spatial terms. We think of time as space. Now, what does this mean? One of the implications of this research is that if the most intuitive way for human beings to think about time is to think of it as space, then the most intuitive and easiest way for people to manage time is to visualize it. We have to see time to manage time realistically. Now, what does that mean, practically speaking? If you're using a to-do list, for instance, then it's going to be a bit harder to manage time realistically because you need a tool to graphically or visually represent your time. And that's exactly what a schedule does. A schedule is a visual representation of what your day or your week or even your month looks like. It's a visual representation of your time. That's why schedules are much, much better for managing time than to-do lists. The problem with to-do lists is that they don't show you your time. It's basically a list of items with no duration and no timing attached to it. Whereas a schedule literally shows you, in a visual way, shows you what your time looks like. And that really forces you to be more realistic with the way you manage your time. For instance, if your schedule shows you an empty block between, say, 4 and 6 p.m. on Monday, and after 6 p.m. you're supposed to go home or you have some other kind of commitment, then you know that you're not going to start working on a 4-hour project at 4 p.m. because you know you're not going to have enough time to do that. So because it's visual, it's a visual representation of your time, it easily and seamlessly shows you what you can and cannot do with your time. So that forces you to be a lot more realistic, which in the end makes for much better, more effective time management. Visualizing time, however, is not enough. Ironically, time management today is mainly about not time, but tasks, work, and getting things done. And I think that's a problem because it kind of detracts from the main purpose of time management, which is managing time first and foremost. That's why I talk a lot about what I call the time first mindset. Now, why is this mindset so important? Well, what do people complain about when they complain about time management? Very often they say things like, I wish I had more time. I wish I had 1 extra hour every day. But the reality is that this common time management complaint is also the most common time management pitfall. I can guarantee you that if most people had 2 or 3 extra hours every day, they would probably still find a way to feel pressed for time. And that's exactly what's been happening since the 1960s. Compared to the 1960s, we now have a lot more leisure time, objectively, but we don't necessarily realize it. If you ask a lot of people today, they actually feel a lot more pressed for time than people did in the 1960s, even though they have more free time than before. Now, why does this happen? Because every time someone asks for a deadline extension, what happens is that that extra time is not necessarily used productively or efficiently. Having more time often does not lead to more quality work, but the opposite. It leads to inefficiency, procrastination, bad prioritization. The more time you give yourself, the more time it will take you to finish. Some of you may be familiar with Parkinson's Law. This is exactly what the time first mindset is all about. Work expands to fill the time available. So if you give yourself 4 hours to write, say, a report, it'll take you 4 hours. But if you give yourself only 3 hours to write that same report, it's probably going to take you only 3 hours with no noticeable loss in quality. So what's the time first mindset all about? It's simply consistentness. Establish time limits to your work. If your work has no time limits, it's going to expand and expand and expand indefinitely. Now, for most people, the time limits are externally imposed, whether it's the end of the workday, whether it's someone asking them to leave their office, or just because the coffee shop is closing. But, and this is really important, the time first mindset takes what researchers call an agentic perspective. It's up to you to empower yourself to set your own time boundaries and time limits. So if you have an entire day to, say, read a book or read a few chapters or write a report, it's really up to you to restrict that time frame to maybe just a few hours, maybe a couple hours. Never let work expand indefinitely. Always establish your own time boundaries if possible. Now, how can you do that practically speaking? There's a few tips I have for you on how to adopt this time first mindset with practical methods. The first one, like I said, is give yourself less time for any given work task. If you're used to read a book chapter in 2 hours or write blog post, say in 6 hours, try to do it in maybe 20-30% less time next time and see if that leads to any loss in quality. Usually it doesn't. If anything, it tricks your brain into being more efficient. Second tip, again, visualize your schedule. Very, very important. Remember that the basis of realistic time management is visualizing time, seeing time. Now, where most people fail at this, the reason most people abandon using their schedule is not necessarily because it's hard or constraining or time consuming. It's simply because their schedule is not visually accessible. And that actually applies to all time management tools and most apps, really. The reason why we abandon our applications, our tools, our methods is because we forget about them. And we forget about them because we can't see them around us. What is out of sight is out of mind. So this applies to the schedule as well. So what I would recommend is find a way to make it visually accessible almost at all times. For instance, by investing in a second or even third computer monitor where you can have your schedule visually accessible at all times. If you can't afford that, there's another place where we usually train our eyes constantly, and that's your smartphone. So maybe it would be a good idea to put your schedule directly onto your phone's home screen so that every time you unlock your phone, the first thing you'll see is your schedule. And that's going to help you Stick to your own boundaries. Remember, anything that's visual is a constant reminder of what's important to you. Third tip, make sure that all the time blocks in your schedule do not exceed your focus limit. So, for instance, if you know that usually you can't work on the same project for more than, say, 2 hours at a time, then it would make no sense to schedule 3 hours or even 4 hours for a given project because you know that any amount of time that you spend over and above your focus limit is going to be unproductive. The marginal returns on your productivity are going to get lower and lower. So once you know that you can focus for, say, 90 minutes at a time, all your time block should be 90 minutes or less. This way you can work on a project, and when you hit your focus limit, it's time to take a break, then transition to another project. And if you haven't finished that first project you were working on, then maybe you can come back to it the next day or a few days later. Finally, fourth method to adopt a time first mindset, use a countdown timer. This is very important because very often when I tell people, you should be very mindful of your time limits, they keep looking at the clock. And of course, that's an additional cognitive demand, like having to constantly remind yourself to look at the clock. That's an additional cognitive demand that detracts from your ability to focus, really. And so using a countdown timer is a way to automate that. You don't need to think about time. You don't need to think about when to take a break or when to transition to another project. Use a countdown timer every time you work on a project so that when the time is up, the time is up. This is a great way to stick to your own time limits, to respect your own time boundaries. Now, I have one caveat. When you use a countdown timer, don't look at it. It should not be visible because looking at a display that counts down the time can induce a sense of time pressure, and that's very counterproductive. You can know when the time is up when you hear that ringtone or a beep or even a vibration if it's a countdown timer app on your cell phone. So a countdown timer is really a tool to keep you honest and help you respect your own boundaries when it comes to time. Now, of course, there's only so much we can cover in this short webinar. The science of time management is extremely vast. There's research on habits, sleep patterns, cognitive offloading, automating tasks, and so on. There's many subtopics in the science of time management. But if you adopt just a couple methods we covered today, it can really go a long way in making you healthier, happier, and more productive. Thank you for your time. I'm Brad Aeon. I hope you've enjoyed this webinar.